Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It begins in a small nameless town that no one ever really leaves. The kind of place where secrets do not vanish, but instead sink deeper into the soil until the roots of every family tree are tangled with them. On the surface, it looks like any other place in America. A white church steeple, a schoolhouse, a row of houses built too close together. But behind those curtains and beneath those smiles, there is something else. Something you aren't supposed to know. The story we're about to unfold doesn't come from books or newspapers or any official record. It comes from the whispers, passed down through a few stubborn voices that refused to stay silent. It is the story of a girl who was forced into a role no one should ever have to play, and of a family that blurred the lines of love, blood, and possession until there was nothing left but shame. She became mother to her brother's child, not because she chose to, not because she wanted to, but because, in that household, choice was never hers to make. At first glance, her story might seem like something out of a grotesque novel, too haunting, too cruel to be true. But the truth has a way of being far darker than fiction. This girl grew up inside four walls that looked ordinary from the outside, but contained the seeds of something broken beyond repair. Generations of silence had built to this moment. What her parents ignored, what her grandparents concealed, had left her defenseless when it came for her. And when it did, there was no one to protect her, no one to stop it. She carried the weight of two impossible identities at once, child and mother, sister and surrogate, a victim and yet expected to carry on as though nothing had happened. This isn't just a family story. It is a story about how secrets rot a place from within until even the innocent are forced to bear the sins of those before them. And in the middle of it all stood a girl the town would later call the most inbred child they had ever seen. They said she was born fragile, with eyes too large for her face, a body that seemed to tremble even when still. The midwife, who had seen countless births, whispered afterward that something was wrong. But in that house, whispers were not welcome. They were silenced, pressed down like a wrinkle smoothed from a bedsheet. The parents would not hear of it, the neighbors dared not ask, and the truth began its burial before the girl could even speak her first word. Her childhood was not marked by toys or laughter, but by the heavy hush of a family pretending to be normal. Every photograph shows her standing a little apart, eyes down, as though she already knew the part she was expected to play. The community around her noticed, of course. People always notice, they just pretend not to. At church, women clutched their purses tighter when she walked by. Boys at school whispered rumors about her bloodline, but no one ever spoke directly, because speaking directly meant dragging something monstrous into the open, and no one wanted to be the one who did that. Her brother was different, older by a handful of years, stronger, untouchable in the eyes of their parents. He was the one given freedom, the one trusted, the one allowed. And from a young age he learned exactly how much he could take without anyone stopping him. The house was small, too small. There are walls that cannot contain what they hear, floors that cannot forget what they've felt. She lived in that closeness, that suffocating proximity, until her brother was not just a sibling anymore, but something else entirely. The first time it happened, she did not even understand what it meant. All she knew was that she had no voice. When she tried to speak of it, her words were turned against her, called lies, called confusion, called hysteria, and once silence was forced upon her, it became permanent. Months later, and her body began to change. No one dared to acknowledge the obvious. The family folded itself tighter, wrapping their shame like a blanket around them, and in time, the truth grew inside her, unstoppable, undeniable. By then it was too late for escape. The child she would bring into the world was not only hers, it was a reflection of everything her family had hidden, every secret buried, every truth denied. And in her own home she became both the crime and the evidence. When the baby was born, the town pretended not to notice. That is how small places survive, by refusing to see what is right in front of them. The church bells rang that Sunday, as they always did. Neighbors brought over casseroles as if the ritual of kindness could erase the unspeakable, and yet, when they looked into the child's face, some of them flinched. They did not say why. They didn't need to. The girl was hardly more than a child herself, and yet now she was called Mother, but not truly. Her mother, the grandmother of this child, took the role of authority. She made the decisions, she claimed the title, and the girl was reduced to something less than human. A vessel, a caretaker, a silent shadow in the background of her own life. The baby, though innocent, carried the weight of shame before he could crawl. His features bore the unmistakable signs of what had been done. In some faces, history writes itself. People saw it in his eyes, in the strange symmetry of his features, in the way he carried traits that should never have been combined. No one dared speak the word, but the silence around him was louder than any accusation. For the girl, this new role was unbearable. Each cry in the night tethered her not only to the child, but to her brother, to her parents, to the unspoken pact of silence. She fed him, she clothed him, she soothed him, but she did so under the crushing knowledge that he was a constant reminder of everything stolen from her. She could not hate him, he was blameless, but she could not love him either, because to love him meant to accept the chain of events that had led to his existence. The townspeople whispered behind closed doors, and yet they still sat beside the family in church pews. They still waved on the street, because to exile the family would mean admitting the truth aloud, and that was far more dangerous than letting them remo in plain sight. This is how evil hides, not in darkness, but in the open, cloaked by politeness, by routine, by the fear of speaking a truth too terrible to face. And so she carried on, invisible, forgotten, a child forced to be mother to her brother's son. The years that followed did not soften her burden. If anything, they deepened it, the way a scar deepens with age instead of fading. The child grew, and with every passing season, his resemblance to the brother became harder to ignore. His laugh, his walk, even the shape of his hands, all reminders that the house she lived in was both cradle and prison. Each time she looked at him, she was forced to relive what no one would allow her to say. By now, the girl's youth had evaporated. She had aged too quickly, her face hollow where innocence should have been. Neighbors would remark in hushed tones that she looked older than her years, that her eyes carried something unsettling, as though she had lived lifetimes no child should endure. But in the official version of the story, nothing was wrong. She was simply shy, quiet, a girl who kept to herself. And the baby, well, wasn't every child a blessing? That was the narrative they repeated until it began to sound almost believable. Her parents never admitted fault. They carried themselves with a strange pride, as if silence could be mistaken for strength. In their world, denial was protection. They believed that as long as the truth was never spoken, it could not harm them. But the opposite was true. The silence rotted them from within. The brother, emboldened by the lack of consequence, carried on as though nothing had happened. He laughed, he worked, he lived freely, while she was shackled by his crime. And yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to show. The girl's health faltered. She grew thin, fragile, and prone to sudden illness. Some whispered she was cursed, that her body was rebelling against the weight of what had been forced upon it. Others muttered that God does not overlook such sins, and that judgment had already begun. Still, no one intervened. The child, meanwhile, was left without answers. He grew up hearies, and whispers he did not understand, glances he could not interpret. Was she his sister, his mother, both, neither? The confusion was a poison, seeping into his identity before he even knew the meaning of the word. In this house, truth was more dangerous than lies. And so, they clung to the lies, even as their lives unraveled around them. By the time the boy reached his teenage years, the story had already warped into legend within the town. No one could trace the exact beginning of the whispers, but everyone had heard them. Some said he was her child, others swore he was her brother. The cruelest ones insisted he was both. In a place where gossip is currency, he became a living rumor, and she became a ghost tethered to him. She rarely spoke in public anymore. The weight of eyes on her was unbearable, each glance a reminder of what people thought they knew. But in silence, her mind replayed the past, looping endlessly, each memory sharper than the last. She lived in a house where she was both victim and prisoner, raising the evidence of her own violation under the watch of those who had allowed it. It was not only her innocence that had been stolen, it was her entire identity. For the boy, the confusion deepened. He asked questions no one would answer. He noticed the way his mother looked away when he asked who his father was. He noticed the way his grandparents grew silent whenever the subject arose, and slowly he began to see the truth in the cruel whispers of the town. Realizing that the story you've been told about your own blood is a lie, that discovery can unmake a person before they even begin to live. And so the curse passed on. Her pain became his inheritance. What was done in silence could not stay buried. It lived inside him, inside his reflection, inside the very marrow of his bones. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out or kept the secret sealed? The years pressed on, and though the girl was no longer a child, she had never truly grown into a woman either. Her life had been suspended, paused at the moment of her violation, frozen in that cruel role forced up on her. And the boy, caught between identities, grew restless, his anger simmering at the edges of silence. Together they lived in the shadow of an unspoken truth, and like all shadows, it only grew darker with time. The boy eventually became a man, but manhood brought him no clarity, only sharper edges. His face had hardened into the mirror of the brother who had fathered him, a cruel reminder that history does not disappear. It repeats itself in the shape of a jawline, in the sound of a laugh. Wherever he went, he carried that resemblance like a brand. The town didn't need to say it aloud. Their eyes said it for them. For the woman, the sister who had been forced into motherhood, the years were less kind. She grew old before her time, her body frail, her spirit hollow. What happens when a life is stolen so young is that the body ages in strange ways, collapsing under burdens it was never meant to bear. Her hair thinned, her skin dulled, and her voice grew so faint it was almost gone. Yet in her silence there was a strange endurance. She had become a living monument to survival, though survival in this case was just another word for endurance of pain. The family itself fractured. What had once been a house of denial became a house of ghosts. The parents, who had believed silence would save them, found themselves isolated. Neighbors still waved, but not as warmly. Whispers still followed, but now tinged with something else: disgust. Their attempt to bury the truth had not erased it. It had only spread it like a stain. The boy turned. Man struggled against his own blood. Some nights he raged at the woman who had raised him, demanding answers she could not give. Other nights he sat silently, unable to look at her without seeing the crime that had created him. He loved her, and he hated her. She was his sister, his mother, his victim, his caretaker. There were no clean lines left, only tangled knots of resentment and dependence. By now, the town's silence was cracking. Stories were told around kitchen tables, warnings passed down like folklore. Don't end up like that family. What here is so had once been hidden became a cautionary tale, a whispered reminder of what happens when secrets are allowed to fester. But still, the core of it, the true, unspeakable horror, remained locked inside the woman's heart. She had never been allowed to speak it, and perhaps by then she no longer had the strength to. Time has a way of distorting memory, but it does not erase it. In that town, years rolled by, yet the story of the girl who became mother to her brother's child remained lodged in the collective mind like a splinter. For those who lived nearby, it was not just gossip. It was a reminder of what silence can allow, of how evil thrives when no one dares to name it. And for her, the years only deepened the prison she could never escape. The boy, now a man, wrestled with the truth of his existence. Some nights he drowned it in alcohol, hoping to silence the whispers in his head. Other times he lashed out at those around him, desperate to place the blame anywhere but within himself. Yet the cruelest truth was one he could not run from. He was both victim and symbol, a breathing embodiment of everything his family had tried to hide, and no matter where he went, he carried that history with him. For the woman, her silence had calcified into something unbreakable. People saw her in the market, shuffling quietly, her eyes always lowered. Some pitied her, others despised her, but no one truly saw her. She had been erased in plain sight, reduced to nothing more than the role forced upon her decades earlier. And yet, when the townspeople spoke of her, there was always a chill in their voices. They did not speak with the casual cruelty of idle gossip, but with the unease of people recounting a haunting, as if her life were not just a tragedy, but a warning, that the sins of one generation do not stay buried, but bleed into the next. It is said that at night she sometimes walked the roads alone, her figure pale in the moonlight, her steps slow, as if each carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Some who saw her swore she looked less like a woman and more like an apparition, alive but hollow, a living ghost tethered to a story no one wanted to claim. Her brother, the father of her child, lived on too, but in whispers of his own. His shadow loomed everywhere, though his name was rarely spoken aloud. The damage he inflicted had outlived even his presence, woven into the bloodline itself. And through it all, the town continued its uneasy silence, caught between denial and dread. As the years blurred into decades, the truth became less a secret and more a curse. Families who had once looked the other way began to speak of it only in hushed warnings to their children. Don't end up like them. Don't let silence take root in your home. It was no longer just her story. It was a stain on the entire town, one that refused to wash away. The boy, who had been born of violation, had now grown into middle age. He carried himself with a restless anger, as though the world owed him an explanation it would never give. Inside him lived a storm. Resentment toward the mother who had been his sister, hatred for the father who was also his uncle, and rage at a world that branded him wrong before he even understood what right was. His identity was a wound that never healed, bleeding into every relationship, every attempt at normalcy. The woman, his mother, his sister, was by now an old figure, fragile and nearly forgotten. Her presence in the town had shifted from scandal to symbol. People no longer whispered as fiercely when she passed. Instead, they simply looked away. She was a reminder of something they wished to forget. Her silence had once been enforced by fear, but now it was her only refuge. To speak, even then, would mean reliving what she had tried her whole life to bury. Her health weakened further, but she endured. Some said it was sheer stubbornness, others called it punishment. She had become a vessel of endurance, her body surviving long past the point most would have broken. Yet inside, she carried the same hollow emptiness she had known since she was a child. Survival was not freedom. It was just a longer form of captivity. What is most haunting is that the family line did not end there. The blood carried forward, spreading into the veins of children and grandchildren who bore the shadow of that first violation. None of them had chosen it, yet it lived in them all the same. Generational curses are not mystical. They are real, etched into the psychology, the silence, and the shame passed from one life to the next. In this way, the girl who became mother to her brother's child never truly disappeared. Her story echoed in every descendant, in every hushed conversation, in every unspoken truth the town still avoids to this day. By the time the woman's life neared its end, she had become less a person and more a legend. In the town's memory, her name was barely spoken, but her story lingered everywhere, like the faint smell of smoke long after a fire has gone out. People avoided the subject, yet it crept into their thoughts whenever they looked at their own families, their own daughters, their own silences. She spent her last years in near-total isolation, the same four walls that had imprisoned her as a child now closing in like a tomb. The son she had raised, her brother's child, remained nearby, though their relationship was strained, fractured beyond repair. He visited out of duty, not love. Their conversations were brief, sometimes wordless. Too much had passed between them, too much had been left unsaid. And yet, even as her body weakened, her silence never broke. She carried her story to the grave, unspoken, unacknowledged, unhealed. But silence does not kill a story, it only makes it more haunting. What she refused to speak, others whispered. What she buried inside herself, the town kept alive in rumor. When she finally died, the funeral was small. A few relatives came, a handful of neighbors, mostly out of obligation. The preacher spoke in vague, measured tones about endurance, about hardship, about quiet strength. But those who were there knew there was more. They knew that lying in the coffin was not just a woman, but the keeper of a secret that had poisoned generations. After her death, the whispers only grew louder. The family name became a warning, a curse, a mark of shame that no one could wash away. The son, already haunted, now carried the weight of being the last living reminder. His anger deepened, his isolation hardened. He lived as though the entire town was staring at him, waiting for him to prove their fears true. And still, the story spread, mutating, shifting, retold, in ways that blurred fact and myth. Some said she had been locked in the house for years. Others claimed the child had been hidden in the woods. None of it was exactly true, yet all of it contained a piece of the truth. The horror was not in the details. It was in the silence that had allowed it all to happen. In the end, her story became something larger than one life. It became a mirror held up to a community, to a culture, to the very human instinct to look away from what is unbearable. The girl who was forced to be a mother to her brother's child did not choose her fate. She did not choose the silence. She did not choose the burden that consumed her. But the silence of others, their refusal to intervene, their decision to bury the truth, made her suffering possible. This is why the story still lingers decades later, like a wound that refuses to close. It is not only a tale of one family's horror, it is a reminder of how easily cruelty hides in plain sight. The signs were always there. The neighbors saw, the parents knew, the church felt the unease, and yet no one stopped it. That is the true horror. That is what makes this story unforgettable. The son she raised, the embodiment of everything done to her, carried the curse forward. His life became its own tragedy, his anger and confusion spilling into everyone around him. He never escaped the shadow of his own creation, never found peace in his bloodline. And so, the cycle continued, not in the same act, but in the echo of trauma, the repetition of silence, the inheritance of shame. Even now, the town does not speak of it openly. But if you go there, if you ask carefully, you will see the way faces change when her name is mentioned. You will hear the pause, the tightening of voices, the quick shift to another subject. That is how buried truths survive, not in words, but in the tension of those who still remember. And maybe that is the greatest warning of all. That what happened to her is not unique. That in every quiet town, in every hidden corner of history, there are stories just like hers, stories of silence, of secrets, of children forced into roles they should never endure, stories that live on because no one dared to speak when it mattered most. So when you think of her, do not think of her as a legend or a rumor. Think of her as what she truly was, a girl whose life was stolen, whose silence became her prison, and whose story was never meant to be heard. And yet, here you are, hearing it now,